562 years ago today, the Battle of Blore Heath during the Wars of the Roses was fought. We're going to find out more about it and also my personal connection to it. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, you're used to on my channel me talking about things like armour and swords and weapons and history, but here we're going to look at one specific battle, the Battle of Blore Heath during the Wars of the Roses, 562 years ago today. That being the 23rd of September, 1459. Now, it just so happens that this timing actually coincides quite well with the sorts of armour and weapons that I often talk about on this channel, and in fact, at the period of my own armour and helmets like this sallet that I'm wearing and things like that. Now, the Wars of the Roses are widely known about, and many people will know them also as the inspiration for Game of Thrones, the setting of Game of Thrones. Essentially, a dynastic struggle between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. It immediately followed after, well, you could say it started before, but it mostly followed after the end of the 100 Years' War between England and France, which also you could say was a dynastic struggle rather than a national struggle as well. The Battle of Blore Heath is a particularly interesting struggle, and I have a personal connection to it, which I'm going to detail a little bit at the end of this video. But let's actually look at the battle itself. So let's dispense with this sword and the helmet so we can talk more about the battle. So the Battle of Blore Heath in 1459 happened when the Earl of Salisbury, who was leading the Yorkist forces from Middleham Castle down to Ludlow Castle to meet up with the main Yorkist forces, was intercepted by the Lancastrian forces under Lord Audley. It seems that Lord Audley had specifically aimed to intercept the Yorkist army and had laid some form of ambush for them. What was special about Blore Heath? Well, we don't really know exactly, but presumably Lord Audley chose it for its sort of topography, its strategic location on the interception route, as it were, and there must have been something special about the landscape that he thought was particularly to his advantage. But fundamentally, as a piece of geography, there was nothing special about it. It was a bit of agricultural land. So Lord Audley's Lancastrian army consisted of about 10,000. It's always difficult knowing exact numbers with medieval battles, even quite late medieval battles like this, but about 10,000 Lancastrian troops, and they set up an ambush by what's known as the Great Hedge. Now, the Great Hedge presumably wasn't quite great enough, because according to some sources, the approaching Yorkist army, who was approaching the ambush, noticed some of the banners or perhaps other things, who knows, polearms, maybe horses, we don't know, essentially not being hidden by the Great Hedge. So the Lancastrian army had supposedly hidden itself with this ambush. The Yorkist army approaching kind of realised what was happening and that there was a Lancastrian army waiting there at Blore Heath for them. Now, the Earl of Salisbury with his Yorkist army at this point had a choice on finding out that there was a Lancastrian ambush. He had an army of about 5,000 men, it's believed, so his army was definitely smaller than the Lancastrian army, although whether that was known or not, who knows. But he made the decision, instead of kind of, I don't know, doubling back or trying to avoid it or do whatever, he decided to draw up his army in line of battle to face whatever odds were against him. Now, we don't know, although obviously sources might vary on this point and historians since might debate this point. We don't know at this point whether the Yorkist army under Salisbury knew that the Lancastrian army under Audley was about twice its size. Okay, but at this point, the odds are very, very uneven. First of all, we've got a Lancastrian army lying in wait with about 10,000 men, and we've got a Yorkist army that in theory wasn't ready for this battle with only 5,000 men. Now, Salisbury at this point must have felt that his right flank was somewhat vulnerable, or perhaps he had some other plan that we no longer have any record of, but for some reason he decided to draw up the baggage train or the wagons in a defensive laager on the right flank. Now, this is very, very interesting because, of course, those of you who watch my channel will notice that I've spoken about Bohemian war wagons and flails and various things actually in recent videos. And so the use of wagons in a defensive formation is not something which is typical in English warfare, particularly at all, although it was possibly something that was either learned during the end phases of the 100 Years' War, or possibly he knew about Bohemian war techniques, or he knew about it from somewhere else. Who knows? Maybe reading military treatises. We just don't know. But very interesting feature of this. So essentially, he's decided to go on the defensive, even though it was the Lancastrians who were laying an ambush. Salisbury, with his Yorkist army of only about half the size, draws up in a defensive formation with a defensive laager of wagons, essentially like a mobile fortification, a stockade on the right flank. Now at this stage it does seem that the two enemy armies were out of sort of bowshot range or out of gunshot range. There would have been some firearms involved as well at this point. And there was also some type of stream or brook running across the middle of what would become the battlefield. And so some time was taken to set up negotiations, diplomacy, parley, and during this period there was no fighting as such, and we can probably assume that both forces were probably also getting themselves into position and fine-tuning the layout of their troops during this time as well. Now we can assume that whatever diplomacy was attempted, it didn't work out, because obviously the battle proceeded. And as was typical with English tactics at this time, the first thing that happened was essentially an exchange of arrows, a longbow duel, an archery duel. Now, many of you will be familiar with the 100 Years' War, where often we see English armies used massed archers against French armies that didn't, for the most part. Not all French, the Burgundians, for example, did use lots of archers, although later on. But for the most part, this was an English tactic, essentially using schiltron defensive formations and using longbows offensively at range and close as well. Now, what's interesting is when we get into the Wars of the Roses, there's some degree of cancelling out, because you've got English armies fighting other English armies with English soldiers using English weapons with English tactics. And so what we find is a lot of the battles of the Wars of the Roses commence with an archery duel. And sometimes the weather, in one case a snowstorm, sometimes a hill, an elevation, sometimes gave an advantage to one force of archers over another force of archers, also just size of force as well. If you've got more arrows going one way than the other way, then it's a war of attrition. However, in this particular case, the archery duel doesn't seem to have been conclusive at all. Now the question is why? Some people argue that it was to do with the distance of the engagement. I find that a dubious argument personally. I think, you know, archers will know at what range they are going to be effective, and if the archers are too far away to have any effect on the enemy, they're going to say to their commanders, why are we shooting our arrows at nothing, because we're not close enough to hit them yet. So I don't think that's a convincing argument. I think there might be other things at play. So I think that one of the possibilities is, given that Salisbury had drawn himself up in perhaps with the laager, perhaps using the laager, perhaps in a defensive formation, perhaps the Lancastrian army hadn't, perhaps they'd been forced to move out from the Great Hedge. It's possible that, despite the fact that the Lancastrians were twice as numerous, it's possible that because the Yorkists under Salisbury were in a better defensive formation, that when the archery duel happened, despite the fact you've got twice as many archers over here as over here, that half as many archers are in a better defensive formation, and so the casualties taken on each side were either negligible or equal on both sides. But I think whatever, unfortunately the sources don't give us enough information on this, whatever the reasons were, despite the fact that the Lancastrians were twice as numerous, the archery duel was not conclusive either way. So now that the archers hadn't had any great effect in either direction, both commanders, Audley and Salisbury, have now got a decision to make. Well, do we attack? Do we wait? Do we retreat? And so it seems that what happens is that at this point, Salisbury did something which we've seen English armies right the way through the 100 Years' War as well do occasionally before, and that is feign a retreat. Perhaps he was actually deciding to withdraw, we don't actually know, but what it ended up being like was it looked like he made a rearwards movement that provoked the Lancastrians to attack. Now, we never know what was in Salisbury's mind, of course. We don't know whether this was a deliberate ruse or whether he was literally deciding, right, okay, I need to get the hell out of here because I've just seen how big this Lancastrian army is. We don't know. Okay, but the fact is that it seems that he made a retrograde, a backwards movement, and that this provoked the Lancastrian army to attack. And so Audley commanded, quite unusually for English armies and battles, A cavalry charge. Now again, the facts are blurry. We simply don't have enough data from the sources available, but something happened to really mess up this cavalry charge, and it is generally thought that probably the presence of this stream or brook in the middle of what became the battlefield of Blore Heath played a major factor in this. And it seems that what happened is that whether Salisbury's Yorkist army was retreating or moving back or feigning, we don't know, it then turned back and basically met the cavalry charge by advancing towards it. So if we imagine the cavalry charge commences sometime before getting to the stream, the Yorkists see that a cavalry charge has begun, cavalry has begun amassing and preparing, and at that point they think, well, there's no point running away, because running away from a cavalry charge is possibly the worst thing you can do, so let's turn and face it. I think this is probably what happened. So they turned to face it, and by the time that they met it, they seem to have met pretty much at this watercourse, at this stream that was running across the battlefield. Now, anybody who's ever even observed horses, it doesn't matter whether you ride or not, will know that crossing a river or a stream is not a particularly easy or quick endeavour for one horse, let alone for a whole, hundreds of them. So simply the Yorkist army met the Lancastrian army pretty much at the stream, which is never going to be a good outcome for what are supposed to be charging cavalry, because they're not going to be charging at this point. So what we do know happened at this point is that the Lancastrians, particularly the cavalry, came a cropper, and things were not going well for them at all. It seems that the Yorkist army had sprung on them. Perhaps, and I think this is probably likely, the Lancastrian cavalry charge only comprised a relatively small percentage of the total Lancastrian army, and what had happened is the whole Yorkist army had turned round and met that small portion of the Lancastrian army and really given it a hammering at the stream and driven it back. So things had gone very bloody, many people lost their lives, things had gone very, very badly at the stream and thrown that portion of the Lancastrian army into disarray. Now what happened next is we're not sure whether the Lancastrian force recovered back, regathered and then came back with the second wave, or if the not yet committed Lancastrian army came in to trying to rescue their friends at the brook. But whatever happened, there was a second wave and a second assault by the Lancastrian army under Lord Audley, and that actually was more successful and managed to allegedly cross the stream and managed to get onto, should we call it, the Yorkist side of the stream. And then there was some very, very bloody and hard fought combat, during which Lord Audley, the leader of the Lancastrian army, was killed, possibly by Sir Roger Kynaston, and we'll hear a little bit more about Sir Roger Kynaston towards the end of this video. Now, once Lord Audley had died, in theory, on paper, Lord Dudley became commander of the Lancastrian army. Obviously, there would have been a period of confusion in which the confirmation that Lord Audley had actually been killed got processed by the Lancastrian army, and Lord Dudley assumed command. During this, and we don't know how long this took, but during this period of time, Lord Dudley then commanded the assault by about 4,000 men on foot, so not cavalry this time, presumably because of they thought, perhaps Lord Dudley had known this all along. What on earth are you doing trying to do a cavalry charge across a field which has got a stream in the middle of it? But anyway, he assaulted with a new force, or perhaps a recovered, regrouped force of Lancastrians, a large number of men-at-arms on foot, perhaps with archers operating with them in unison. And this was equally unsuccessful and was yet again crushed by the Yorkist army. Now, at some point during this or after this, again, the exact chronology of how things panned out at Blore Heath are not at all clear from the sources, but at some point during this, a very critical thing happened, which is something that we see happen over and over again in the Wars of the Roses, and as I mentioned, Game of Thrones, it's a detail, a plot detail, which is of course used in stories like those in Game of Thrones, and that is around 500 of the Lancastrian army defected to the other side. Now you can imagine, to an army for which this has already been going pretty damned badly, for 500 Lancastrians to defect to the Yorkist side and then literally start attacking the people who'd been their allies only minutes before, it just completely, that was the end for the Lancastrian army. It seems to have just collapsed, and they started fleeing. They started routing in every direction. And in fact, the pursuit of the Lancastrian army, which then ensued with the Yorkist army plus the 500 Lancastrians they've just recruited, went on into the night. And it's estimated that around 2,000 Lancastrians died during this conflict, which if you imagine if the Lancastrian army was about 10,000, 1 in 5 is a pretty high casualty rate. Overall, it's estimated that maybe around 1,000 Yorkists died. Now, bear in mind, if we rewind all the way back to the beginning of this battle, on paper, we believe there were around 10,000 Lancastrians, 5,000 Yorkists. So they both lost 1 in 5 as a statistic. But it was a crushing defeat for the Lancastrian army when you consider that the Yorkist army, although they still lost 1 in 5, they only lost half as many men in total, and they started off with only half as many men. The fact that they conclusively crushed an army twice their size that was lying in ambush for them. What a victory for the Earl of Salisbury. Now, this size disparity and the fact that the Lancastrians were much stronger in that area, had a lot more soldiers than the Yorkists, also plays into a little bit of the aftermath of the battle as well. And there's a nice story from one chronicle whereby Salisbury was so concerned that the Lancastrians would regroup and attack the Yorkist army again, that he actually paid a local friar to fire a cannon, which is a nice detail because therefore we know that there were cannons in use. But he employed a friar to fire a cannon throughout the night while the Yorkist army moved off, so that any Lancastrians in the area would assume that the battle was still going on at Blore Heath, and it would act as a distraction while the Yorkist army slinked away. Nice little detail there. Whether it's true or not, we will never know, of course. But also the nice detail there that there were certainly, I think, firearms, probably in the form of handguns, but also, that is, handheld cannons at this date, and of course artillery pieces were in some degree of use throughout the Wars of the Roses, but even at Blore Heath. So there we go, 562 years ago to this day, this Battle of Blore Heath. Not a widely known, not a widely spoken about or researched battle. It's not as sort of famous as Tewkesbury or Towton or St Albans or Bosworth or anything like this, but nevertheless an important battle in the first sort of phase of the Wars of the Roses. Very interesting battle, which I think there's still a lot of, there's still potential for research to be done on it. Now, I mentioned that towards the end of this video I'd mention a personal connection with this battle, and so I have to be honest, I actually didn't know very much about Blore Heath, despite the fact that I've been reading about the Wars of the Roses since I was a teenager. I'd never really taken much notice of Blore Heath, but doing some family history research made me take more notice of it. And the reason is that Sir Roger Kynaston, who killed Lord Audley, was my 12th great-grandfather. I only became aware of this actually about 2 years ago. I've been doing a lot of family history research over the years, and I went down one particular line on my father's side, and I got stuck at some point in the 16th century, and then I made a breakthrough and I finally made a connection, and I got back to essentially one aristocratic family that led me back to Sir Roger Kynaston, and who I'd never heard of before. And then I found out about the fact that he was allegedly the person that killed Lord Audley at the Battle of Blore Heath, and I thought, wow, how cool is that? That's a period I'm interested in. How amazing it is to have a personal, in theory, blood connection to this person who was there. And then I did more research. I did more family history research, and I found on a completely different branch of my family, still on my dad's side, but a completely different part of my dad's side's family, I actually found someone else called Sir Adam de Bostock, Lord Adam de Bostock, who was also at the Battle of Blore Heath on the other side. So Roger Kynaston was on the Yorkist side, alleged to have killed Lord Audley in hand-to-hand combat. And on the other side, on the Lancastrian side, was Lord Adam de Bostock, who was my 14th great-grandfather in a different line. And he actually survived, despite the fact he was on the Lancastrian side. He was one of the 4 in 5 Lancastrians who survived the battle. But his son, his eldest son, who was also called Adam, died at the Battle of Blore Heath. I'm descended from one of the younger sons, incidentally, obviously not the one that died without issue. So, you know, he lost his eldest son, beloved to him no doubt, at the Battle of Blore Heath. And so, as I posted on our Facebook page in commemoration, this is a reminder that we love medieval history, we love learning about this period and the weapons, and we glorify it and romanticize it. But at the end of the day, this is about bloody conflict. And whilst knights in shining armour are a beautiful thing to think about and dress up as, and, you know, play with swords and this kind of stuff, at the end of the day, this was about people living and dying, and very often these people were related. And although those people weren't particularly closely related at all, they're related via me. They are both my ancestors. One was on the winning side very prominently, and the other one was on the losing side quite prominently, and lost his eldest son. So these were bloody conflicts, dynastic conflicts between families during a period when there was severe brutality sometimes, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. I think we should sort of remain human when we're analysing and talking about these periods of history. Anyway, so I dedicate this video to the fallen of the Battle of Blore Heath, a battle that doesn't get much credit or notice these days. But if you want to see a wonderful artistic rendition, representation of a scene from the Battle of Blore Heath, I've linked below to Graham Turner, fantastic artist doing military history mostly, or most famous for military history art, a scene from the Battle of Blore Heath by Graham Turner. And thanks very much for watching the video. I hope this has been interesting to you. Also, I would just mention on a tangent, I am considering doing some sort of family history, ancestry and DNA related videos in the future. If there is an interest or an appetite for that kind of stuff, it's something that I do as a hobby, I'm interested in, and I perhaps have some knowledge and wisdom and experience and views to partake. If you're interested in that, then comment underneath and say so, and it might give me an idea about whether there's any more appetite for that kind of thing. Thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed, please consider doing so, and I'll see you again soon back on the channel. Cheers, folks.